Kansas Territory, 1872. Luke Zachary had his rifle rested easy in one hand, his boots silent on the soft dirt path between the henhouse and the barn. The early morning sun filtered through the cottonwoods, casting narrow slits of light across the yard. He had come out expecting to check the fence line before day heat set in. But what he found instead was a girl with wild eyes and torn stockings, crouched low by the chicken coop with her hands full of eggs. He leveled his voice, calm but firm. "You planning to bake a pie or just starving?" She froze. Her shoulders twitched like she was about to bolt, but she did not run. Slowly she stood up, her hands still cupped around the stolen eggs. Her skirt was muddy at the hem, the leather of her boots cracked down the seams. She looked about 19 or 20, but her face carried more years than that. Her hair was dark and tangled, pinned back in a way that had long since given up. "I ain't here to rob you," she said, voice dry, quiet. Luke tilted his head. "Well, you are holding my eggs." The girl glanced down, then back up, her chin lifted. "I was going to leave a rabbit. I have one in my bag." Luke nodded toward the satchel slung over her shoulder. "You got kids." Her jaw tightened. "Two, a boy and girl, left back in a lean-to about a mile west." Luke let the silence stretch, eyes scanning her face. She waited still as a fence post, but he could see the tremble in her hands. Now she was not a thief by trade, just a mother trying to survive. "You got a name?" he asked. "Recarver." "Well, Recarver," he said, setting his rifle against the chicken coop. "You want to work or wear white?" She blinked, confused. "What?" He stepped closer, voice steady. "I got a ranch needs a cook, someone to help with chores. That's work. Or if you want something steadier, there's a preacher rides out twice a month from town. I could marry you." Her mouth parted, shocked. "You don't even know me." "Know enough. You did not run and you did not lie." Ree looked away, her eyes glistening in the sharp morning light. "I just needed to feed my kids." Luke nodded once. "Then come get them. You all can stay in the bunkhouse until we figure things out." She stared at him like she was waiting for the trap to spring, but he did not move. Finally she whispered, "You serious?" "I do not joke much before breakfast." She let out a breath like she had been holding it for days. "All right, I will get them." Luke watched her cross the yard, walking faster now, like if she did not hurry this might all disappear. When she was out of sight, he picked up the eggs she had dropped and carried them into the kitchen. The hen clucked behind him as if it approved. An hour later, he stood on the porch, arms crossed, as returned from the trees with two children trailing behind her. The girl looked about 6 with a sunburned nose and big brown eyes. The boy was maybe 4, holding a ragged toy horse in one hand and his sister's fingers in the other. "This is Bee," Ree said, touching the girl's shoulder. "And this is Boone." Luke nodded to them. "Welcome." The children looked up at their mother, wary. Ree gave a small nod back, and they stepped up the stairs. Inside, Luke led them to the bunkhouse beside the barn. It was small and plain, but clean. "You will have to share the bed," he said, "but it is dry and the stove works." Ree looked around, her shoulders dropping. "Thank you. Come by the main house when you are ready. I will show you the kitchen." Ree hesitated. "You really meant it about the work or the other thing?" Luke met her eyes. "I do not say things I do not mean." She studied him again, quieter this time. "Then I will work." Luke gave a small nod and stepped off the porch. "All right, let us start with lunch." That afternoon she stood in his kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back clean. She moved like someone who had cooked for years, who knew when to salt and when to stir. The children sat on the porch eating biscuits and watching the chickens. Luke watched her from across the room. "You from around here?" "No, from Missouri. My husband died 2 winters ago. We came west because there was nothing left." He nodded. "You got people back there?" "Not any I would want to see again." The silence between them stretched, calm and easy. Outside, the wind shifted the trees gently. Luke leaned against the doorframe. "You cook like someone who used to feed a whole family." "6 brothers," she said. "I was the oldest." He smiled slightly. "That explains the biscuits." That night, after the children were asleep and the stars were out, Ree stood outside the bunkhouse, arms wrapped around herself. Luke approached, holding a blanket. "Night gets cold out here," he said, handing it to her. She took it, their fingers brushing. "Thank you. You did good today." She looked up at him, her expression soft but tired. "I was scared when you caught me." "I know. I thought you would shoot." "I thought about it," he said deadpan. She laughed, surprised. Then her smile faded into something gentler. "You are different than I thought." Luke looked out at the land. "I lost people too. Everyone's trying to hold on to something." Ray's eyes stayed on him, and for the first time in a long while, the fear in them eased. "Good night, Luke." "Good night, Ray." As he walked away, the stars above seemed a little brighter, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself believe something might finally stay. The next morning, Ray was up before the rooster called. The bunkhouse floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet as she stirred the fire back to life. Boone slept curled against Bee, his little hand pressed to her ribs like he was still guarding her in his dreams. She pulled the quilt tighter over them and stepped outside, the cold dew soaking into the hem of her dress. She crossed the yard with steady steps, hair braided back in a tighter plait than yesterday, apron folded beneath her arm. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, but the light had a blue cast, and the hush that settled over the land made her breath catch. It had been years since she'd felt the land speak quiet like that. Luke was already in the barn, brushing down the gray gelling with long, even strokes. He didn't turn when she approached, but his voice carried. "There's coffee on the stove. You can start with the cornmeal." "I can sew too," she said, voice calm. He paused, looked over his shoulder. "You offering for the kitchen or something else?" "For what needs doing," she said. Her eyes didn't flinch from his. He gave a slow nod and turned back to the horse. "There's a tear in the work shirts, second peg in the storeroom." By the time the sun had climbed above the ridge, Ray had 2 loaves rising on the back of the stove. The children fed and dressed, and a pile of mended linens folded neat beside the woodbin. Her body moved through the work like it remembered its rhythm. The motion steadied her, quieted the noise in her ribs. Bee followed her with a quiet diligence, setting spoons and wiping the table, her thin arms working harder than they should have needed to. Boone played in the dirt with small stones humming under his breath. Luke worked the east fence line until midday, then came in with dust on his collar and a limp in his left stride. "Horse step wrong?" Ray asked as he washed up at the basin. Rusty post gave out, nothing broken. She handed him a plate, warm cornbread and beans, and sat across from him without invitation. The children were napping in the shade near the porch, Boone using Bee's skirt as a pillow. Luke chewed, swallowed, then said, "You've been around livestock before some." "My father raised mules mostly for hauling." "Think you can drive a team?" She met his eyes. "I can learn it fast," he nodded. "I'll need to haul lumber from town come Friday." "Retrace the grain in the tabletop. You ever been married before?" He didn't answer right away. "No. Thought about it once, but she left for Colorado before I could ask." "Why didn't you go after her?" "She wanted city streets. I got dirt in my boots." Ray let that settle. "My husband was a carpenter, quiet man, died slow." Luke didn't press. He let her speak into the quiet if she wanted or not. She looked up. "He was kind, but not built for this. After he passed, we tried to stay with some cousins near Westport. They weren't cruel, just full up. I figured West was better than starving where folks could see you." Luke nodded once. "You're strong. I'm still here," she said. "That's all." They ate in silence after that, but it wasn't a hollow one. Luke's gaze lingered on her hands, scarred, capable, steady. Her eyes were sharp, not just with survival, but with something deeper. She didn't ask for comfort, she built her own. When the sun dipped low enough to turn the hills gold, Luke saddled the gelling and led it toward the creek. Rye was chopping carrots by the stove, but she looked up as he passed. "I'll check the line traps, back before dark. You want me to keep supper warm?" He paused, adjusted the strap on the saddlebag. "You could come with me," she blinked. "And the children, they'll be safe here. I left my dog with them." She hesitated only a moment. The knife clicked against the wood once more. Then she wiped her hands and followed him out. They rode in silence at first. The mare Luke saddled for her, steady-footed and patient. The trail dipped into a hollow where the air grew cooler and the scent of wet stone rose from the creep. "You always this quiet?" she asked when the only sound was hooves and the wind through dry grass. "Not much to say when a man lives alone." "You still do," he looked at her. "Not anymore." Her fingers tightened on the reins, but she didn't look away. They reached the traps just before dusk. Luke knelt by the snare, lifting a fat rabbit free, then reset the wire with quick, practiced motions. "You ever think about leaving all this behind?" Ray asked, crouching beside him. "Sometimes, but I built this land with my own hands. It's not much, but it's mine." She studied him. The way his mouth pulled tight when the wind shifted. There was a steadiness in him, a kind of weight that made her feel less like she was drifting. "I don't want charity," she said. "Then don't take it. Take a place." He stood, offered her the rabbit. She took it without a word. They rode back under a pink stray, the prairie wide and open around them. As they neared the house, the windows glowed with lamplight. Inside, Bee had set the table without being told. Boone was curled beneath the quilt, thumb in his mouth. The dog lay near the hearth, tail thumping once. Ree looked at Luke, her voice low. "You meant what you said about marrying?" "I do," she nodded, slow and sure. "Not yet, but I'm thinking on it." Luke tipped his hat and stepped back toward the door. "Take all the time you need. I'll still be here." And for the first time in longer than she could say, that felt like a promise that might hold. By the end of the week, the wind shifted. It hadn't turned cold yet, but the smell of dry leaves and smoke drifted through the cottonwoods, warning of what was ahead. Ree stood outside the barn, watching Luke hitch the bugboard for the trip into town. The morning light glinted off the rivets on the harness, and the horses flicked their tails against the last of the summer flies. "Bee said she can watch Boone," Ree said, adjusting her shawl. "She's careful." Luke tightened the trace and looked up. "You trust her with him. She knows what to do if he coughs too hard." "I left her a kettle and the ash bucket full." He gave a short nod. "All right, you ride up front." She climbed into the seat as he climbed up beside her, and they set off without another word. The road to town was long and rutted, the kind that wore through wagon wheels if you weren't careful. The prairie stretched wide on either side, golden and quiet. A hawk circled above, its shadow flickering across the horses' backs. Luke leaned forward and squinted toward the horizon. Barrels cracked on the rain catch. "Need to see if Cooper's got another one. I can trade for cloth." Ree said, "Boone's coat's too short in the sleeves." He glanced at her hands folded in her lap. "You sew with wool." "My mother did. I watched enough." They rode another mile without speaking, the sun warming their shoulders. The town didn't rise suddenly, just crept into view, worn and spare, with half the buildings leaning into the wind. The general store's porch slanted to one side, and the bell above the blacksmith's door had lost its ring. Luke pulled up beside the mercantile and tied off the res. "You want to come in or wait?" "I'll come. I need to see the cloth with my own eyes." He held the door and she stepped inside. The smell of kerosene and soap thick in the air. Shelves were lined with jars, spools, sacks of flour. A boy behind the counter gave a quiet nod. "Afternoon, Mr. Zachary. Ma in the back." Luke tipped his hat and crossed to the back wall. Ree ran her fingertips across the bolts of fabric, pausing at a faded blue that reminded her of a sky before storms. She held it up. "This one will do." Luke returned with a coil of rope and an oil tin. You sew by hand. I don't need a needle board, just thread that doesn't snap. He took the cloth from her, added it to the pile. Pick anything else. She looked toward the shelf of tin toys, then away. No, he followed her gaze. Boone's got that wooden horse. He doesn't want a tin one. He's got enough. Luke didn't press. At the counter, he paid in coin and flower credits. Outside, he handed her the cloth. You don't ask for much. I've learned not to, she said, folding it neatly. He stepped closer, voice low. You don't have to keep living like you're waiting for the floor to fall through. She looked at him then, steady. You can't build on air. I'm not asking you to, he said, but I won't vanish. She held his gaze, heart thudding once, hard on the ride back. Clouds gathered low over the hills. The horses picked up their pace, sensing weather. R tucked the cloth beneath her coat. Luke drove with one hand, the other resting near his thigh. When they reached the homestead, Bee was on the porch with Boone in her lap, both dry and safe. That night, Ree lit a lantern in the bunkhouse and cut the cloth by firelight. She worked in silence, her stitches even. Boone slept against her hip, Bee curled with a book she'd borrowed from Luke's shelf. Her children were warm, fed. The wind outside moaned against the walls, but the fire held. A knock came soft at the door. She opened it to find Luke holding a tin cup. I brought you something, he said, handing it over. She sipped. It was cider, warm and sharp. He didn't step inside, just stood with his hat in his hand. You ever think about what comes after all this? Rye looked down at her children, then back at him. I do now. Luke's voice was quiet. I want to build something steadier than just fences and barns. I want someone beside me who knows what it means to fight their way through. She stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed against the chill. I've been wife to a man who needed tending. I won't be that again. I wouldn't ask it, he said. I want a partner. The quiet between them wasn't fragile now. It was full of something waiting to turn real. Ree looked at the dark horizon, then back at him. Ask me again when it's colder. When the snow comes, Luke nodded once. I will. She reached out, touched his sleeve. Thank you for the cloth. He didn't pull away. You'll make something good out of it. She watched him walk back across the yard, the lantern from the main house casting a low glow. When she stepped back inside, Boone stirred and turned toward her in his sleep. She pulled the quilt higher over them all. Outside, the wind picked up, but the walls held. The first frost came overnight, silvering the grass and leaving the pump handle stiff with ice. Ree, pulling Boone's coat around his shoulders and tucking the quilt tighter around Bee. She moved through the dark with quiet hands, easing the door open without waking them. A kettle was already on in the main house when she arrived, and the chimney had begun to breathe out smoke. Luke was outside, splitting wood by lantern glow. He paused when she stepped into the yard, breath rising in thin clouds. You're up early, he said, setting the axe into the stump. I couldn't sleep. He nodded once and handed her a thick glove. Handles slick this morning. She took it and embraced the next log. They worked without speaking for a while, the rhythm passing between them like a tide. The sun eased above the trees, and she turned her face toward it, eyes closed. I used to dream of places with no winter, she said. Luke set the axe aside. You ever think of going south? I did once, but I don't want to chase something I've never seen. He studied her, the morning light catching the edge of her jaw. You've got a way of saying things like they're nailed down. I've had enough looseness in my life, she said, brushing wood chips off her skirt. They brought the split logs to the house together, loading the bin beside the stove. She stirred the fire while he washed his hands, and they fell into a kind of morning ease that didn't need names. After breakfast, Luke pulled on his coat. I'll be down by the lower pasture. Cattle scattered after that wind last night. She nodded, wiping her hands on a cloth. I'll walk the creek edge, get the last of the herbs before the ground locks. He paused at the door. Take the rifle. Snows bring coyotes hungry enough to try anything. I will. She left Boone and Bee with a neighbor's wife a quarter-mile east, offering a jar of plum preserves in exchange. The woman nodded, took the children without question. Folks had learned not to ask too much about Ray. By late morning, she was knee-deep in cadales and frostbitten thistle. Her fingers stung, but she moved steady, her satchel filling with dried stems and roots. The sky above was wide and brittle, like it might crack if the wind blew too hard. She didn't hear the horse until it was close. She turned, hand on the rifle, but it was Luke, reins in one hand, his eyes sharper than usual. "Found a calf caught in the fence," he said. "I frayed it, but the wire's a mess." She stood brushing frost from her skirt. "I can help mend it." He dismounted. "You know, fence wire. I know how to hold it steady while someone else twists." They worked their way to the slope where the calf had run, its tracks still fresh in the brittle grass. The wire had snapped off the post and curled like a snake. Luke anchored it while Ree held the slack. Her hands bled in 2 places from the barbs, but she didn't flinch. "I wouldn't have expected this from the girl I found stealing eggs," he said after a long silence. "I wouldn't have expected a man to offer a choice," she said, eyes on the wire. He twisted the last loop and stepped back. "I meant it that day. Still do." She turned toward him, wind tugging loose a strand of her hair. "I know. That's why I'm still here." They walked back slowly, the horses trailing behind them. The sun dipped low, washing the hills in amber. When they reached the yard, Ree paused by the porch. "I've been thinking," she said. Luke waited, still holding the reins. "You asked me if I wanted to work or wear white," she said, voice steady. "I chose work because it was what I knew. But that doesn't mean I never thought about the other." He stepped closer. "You thinking about it now?" She nodded once. "If it's still on offer." He looked at her in that long, unreadable way of his. "I've got no ring, no proper ceremony planned. I don't need either," she said. "I just need a place that won't slip from under me." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather cord worn from use. "My mother braided this for my father before she died. He gave it to me when I left home." She took it, fingers brushing his. "It's enough." Luke wrapped it around her wrist twice, tied it with care. "Then you're mine. If you want it, I do." The last of the sun caught her face, and for the first time since Missouri, she let herself smile without fear of what came after. Inside, Boone and Bee were already asleep, curled together by the hearth. She covered them gently, then stepped back into the doorway. Luke was still outside looking toward the ridge. She slipped her hand into his. "I'll take your name tomorrow," she said, "but tonight, just let me stand beside you." He didn't speak. He just turned his palm and held on. The preacher rode out from town the morning after the first snow. He came slow on a chestnut gelding wrapped in a thick coat with the collar turned up and a small Bible tucked under one arm. Luke met him at the gate, boots crunching through the crusted frost, and led him toward the house where redded by the hearth with her hands drying from the wash basin. There was no gathering, no lace curtain or silver ring, just the children, clean and bundled, the fire burning steady, and the scent of boiled apples coming off the stove. Bee stood beside the table, clutching a sprig of wintergreen Ree had tucked into her braid, while Boone clung to Luke's pant leg, eyes wide and curious. Ree didn't wear white. She wore her mother's dress, a faded sage green with mended seams, and she stood tall through the short ceremony, her fingers steady in Luke's callous grip. When the preacher asked if she took him freely, she nodded once and said yes, clear and sure. Luke answered with the same quiet strength, no hesitation in his voice. When the preacher left, he accepted a sack of flour and a jar of honey for his trouble, tipping his hat as he turned back down the road. The wind had picked up, and the sky was thick with the promise of more snow before dusk. Inside, Luke stirred the fire, while Bee helped reladle stew into bowls. Boone sat cross-legged on the floor, rocking the wooden horse back and forth across the plank boards. The house was warm, Not just from the stove, but from something settled, something real. After supper, Luke led her outside, a lantern in one hand, the other wrapped around hers. The stars were sharp and close overhead, and the air smelled of pine smoke and cold iron. "I built this place hoping someone might want to stay," he said, voice low. "Most days I didn't think anyone would." Ree looked out across the fields, the fence lines white-edged and the barn roof silver with frost. "I never thought I'd want to stay again." He turned to her, eyes searching hers in the dark. "But you do," she nodded. "I do." He drew her close, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of a man who'd waited long enough to know what he held. Her head rested just beneath his chin, and the lantern light flickered across the porch rail. That night they shared the bed in the main house. The children slept in the bunkhouse with the dog curled between them, a blanket pinned tight at the corners. Ree's hair was unpinned, her hands soft with salve. Luke lay beside her quiet, his hand finding hers beneath the quilt. "I thought I'd forgotten how to be close to someone," she said. "You didn't forget," he said. "You just never had someone who stayed." She turned toward him, her breath warm against his neck. "You're staying. I already did." They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. The wind howled against the eaves, but inside the walls it was still. By spring the land had softened, and the creek ran full again. The children had grown into the rhythm of the place, Bee helping in the garden, Rose Boone trailing after Luke in the barn. Ree had planted herbs beside the porch, her hands always busy, her voice lighter than it had been in years. When Luke built the new chicken coop, Bee painted a crooked flower on the side. Ree laughed for the first time without flinching. Boone named the new calf after the preacher's horse, and Luke didn't correct him when he tied a ribbon around its neck. They didn't speak of the past much. It had its place, sealed beneath the frost and the miles. What mattered now was the soil beneath their boots, the roof that held, the love that came not in grand words, but in steady hands, and the way Luke always waited for Ree to sit before serving himself. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned the color of sweet tea, Ree leaned against the doorframe, watching Luke mend the gate hinge. She felt the warmth of the house behind her, heard Boone laughing somewhere near the well, and smelled bread cooling on the windowsill. "Luke," she called, her voice easy now. He looked up, wiping his hands on a cloth. She crossed the yard barefoot, her skirt brushing the grass. When she reached him, she wrapped her arms around his waist and rested her head against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered. He held her close, his chin resting on her hair. "For what?" "For teaching me that staying can be safe." He kissed her temple, slow and sure. "You taught me that too." Years later, folks in town would speak of the Zacharys as quiet folk who kept to their land, but whose doors were always open to a soul in need. No one ever went hungry at their table. No child ever wandered past the fence without being walked home. And every time the snow came thick and white and silent, Ray would look out across the fields, her hand wrapped in Luke's, and know they had not just survived, they had built a life together.